Welcome to the final resting place of an entire corporation and one of the biggest cover-ups in gaming history. In September of 1983, a convoy of trucks pulled into the Alamogordo Desert in New Mexico. They weren't carrying oil, they weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying 14 truckloads of video games. Workers dug a hole, they dumped them in, and buried them under 12 feet of concrete. Those games were Atari's last secret, and that burial, it was the end of a $2 billion empire. But the story of why those cartridges ended up in the desert, it isn't really about a bad video game. It's about a man, a company, and one of the most spectacular self-destructions in business history. Nolan Bushnell was not supposed to change the world. He grew up in Clearfield, Utah, a small town where nothing particularly interesting ever happened. His father was a cement contractor. His mother kept the house. It was a quiet, ordinary life, but Nolan was not a quiet, ordinary kid. While he was at university, he worked nights at an amusement park, operating games, watching people spend their quarters, studying what made them come back for more. He became obsessed with one question: what makes a game irresistible? By day, Nolan studied engineering at Utah State. By night, he played chess on one of the university's mainframe computers, a machine the size of a room worth more than most people's houses. See, most students saw that computer as a tool. Nolan saw it as a toy. In 1962, MIT had created the first real video game, Space War. This was a pivotal point for Nolan. He loved it. But alas, there was one problem. It ran on a computer that cost $120,000, a game only scientists and engineers could access. Nolan played it once and made a decision that would change everything. I'm going to make this available to everyone. So Nolan moved to California and took a job at Ampex, an electronics company. The work paid well, but the work was boring. Every evening, he went home and worked on his real project. He wanted to take Space War, strip it down, simplify it, and put it in an arcade cabinet that anyone could play for a quarter. He called it Computer Space. In 1971, it became the world's first commercially sold arcade video game. And it flopped. Completely, totally, embarrassingly.
But Computer Space, your first game, really didn't take off, really wasn't terribly successful. What was the cause of that?
Well, I loved it, all my friends loved it, but all my friends were engineers. It was very difficult. You used Newton's first law. It was one of those games which was very difficult to play. It took a relatively high technical background.
Players didn't understand it, the controls were too complicated, the instructions were too long. But Nolan went back to work. First, he hired a young engineer named Al Alcorn. Gave him a simple task as a training exercise: recreate the world's most basic sport as a video game. Just 2 lines and a dot, a ball and 2 paddles, a score. He called it Pong. So the two installed the first prototype in a bar in Sunnyvale, California. And within 2 weeks, the machine broke down. But not from neglect. The coin box was too full to function. Nolan Bushnell had cracked the code, and in 1972, he founded a company to bring it to the world. He named it after a term from the ancient Japanese board game Go, a word you say when you're about to capture your opponent's piece. Atari. Pong didn't just succeed, it took over. Within months of that first machine appearing in Sunnyvale, Nolan's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Bar owners, restaurant managers, bowling alley operators, all asking the same question: how do we get one? Atari couldn't build them fast enough. In its first year, Pong generated $3 million in revenue. For context, Magnavox had already sued them for patent infringement. That's how you know you've made it. By 1973, clones were appearing everywhere. Competitors smelled blood. They copied the cabinet, they copied the controls, copied everything they could see. And Nolan Bushnell did what every great founder does when the market catches up to them. He moved faster. Paddle games, driving games, arcade cabinets multiplying across America like wildfire. But Nolan's eyes were already somewhere else, somewhere nobody had looked yet. What if you didn't have to leave your living room? In 1975, Atari struck a deal with Sears, one of the largest retailers in the United States. The result? Home Pong, a version of the game built into a single unit. Just plug it into your television. Sit on your sofa. No quarters, no arcade, no leaving the house. That Christmas, Sears couldn't keep it on the shelves. But Nolan Bushnell wanted to own the living room. And so, enter the Atari 2600. It wasn't just a gaming console. It was the gaming console. For the first time in history, you could buy one machine and play hundreds of different games on it. All you had to do was swap the cartridge. Simple, elegant, $1 billion idea hiding in plain sight. Within a year, the 2600 was in millions of American living rooms. Kids were begging for it at Christmas. Teenagers lining up around the block, parents who had never touched a game in their lives buying one anyway. And Nolan Bushnell, he was living like a rock star. Hot tubs installed in the office, company parties that made the newspapers, a culture so loose, so electric that journalists flew in from across the country just to write about it. Atari wasn't a company anymore, it was a movement, and the numbers proved it. By 1980, Atari was generating over $400 million a year. By 82, $2 billion, the fastest growing company in American history. But here's the part they don't put in the press releases. By the time that $2 billion figure hit the headlines, Nolan Bushnell wasn't there to see it. In 1976, facing mounting costs, a cash crisis, and the enormous price tag of developing the 2600, Nolan made a decision. He sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. Yeah, he did become rich overnight, but he handed over control of everything he'd built. Warner brought in suits, executives with spreadsheets instead of joysticks, men who saw Atari not as a revolution, but as a revenue line. And Nolan, the guy who hired people based on passion, who believed games were an art form, who ran meetings from a hot tub, was pushed out of his own company in 1978. He sat in the parking lot on his last day. The logo he'd designed, the name he'd chosen from a Japanese board game, the empire he'd built from a single machine in a single bar, all of it still standing, just without him. Pac-Man was the most popular arcade game on the planet. The little yellow circle eating dots had become a cultural phenomenon. A cartoon, a cereal, a merchandise empire worth hundreds of millions. And Atari paid $100 million to bring it home. 12 million cartridges. That was the number. 12 million units manufactured, more than the total number of 2,600 consoles even in existence. Think about that. They made more copies of the game than there were machines to play it on. You see, they weren't thinking about the player anymore. They weren't thinking about someone sitting down, turning on the TV and feeling something like Nolan was. They were thinking about units. The port was rushed, the graphics were degraded, the beloved dots, the whole point of the game, barely visible on screen. The ghosts barely functioned. Players noticed immediately, and for the first time in Atari's history, 7 million cartridges were returned. And then came the decision that buried everything. In the summer of 1982, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial was breaking every box office record ever set. The highest grossing film in history. The world was in love with a small, wrinkled alien who just wanted to go home. Atari saw an opportunity. They paid $21 million, more than the entire production budget of the original Jaws, for the rights to make the E.T. video game. Then, somebody in that company gave the developer 5 weeks to build it. 5 weeks. A great video game takes 12 to 18 months. Careful design, relentless testing, the kind of obsessive, detail-driven craft that Nolan Bushnell had built the entire company on. Now, Howard Scott Warshaw, the developer handed the project, was talented. He'd built the Raiders of the Lost Ark game for Atari in 5 months, and that was considered fast. But this was something else entirely. The E.T. game launched December of 1982. It was a disaster. Players fell into pits they couldn't escape. The objective was incomprehensible. The controls were broken. Critics didn't just dislike it, they were confused by it. It became, overnight, the most infamous video game ever made. And out of the 5 million cartridges Atari had produced, they only sold 1.5 million. The rest sat in warehouses, unsold, unwanted, a monument to the single wrong decision made by people chasing numbers on a spreadsheet. By 1983, Atari's revenues had collapsed from 2 billion to 100 million in a single year. That's 1.9 billion gone. The video game industry, the one Nolan Bushnell had built from a single coin-operated machine in a bar in Sunnyvale, had crashed. Completely, entirely, catastrophically. Which brings us back to September of 1983. 14 truckloads, Alamogordo, New Mexico. The workers who buried those cartridges didn't know what they were really burying. They thought they were disposing of excess inventory, but they were burying something bigger. They were burying the dream of a young man who once stood in front of a glowing screen in the middle of the night and thought, everyone should feel this. They were burying Nolan Bushnell's vision. Nolan wasn't there that day. He'd been gone for 5 years. He heard about it in the way the rest of the world did. In the news. Here's what's strange about the story of Atari. It didn't have to end this way. Crash wasn't inevitable. E.T. disaster wasn't inevitable. The suits taking over, none of it was inevitable. At every turn, from computer space to Pong, from arcade cabinet to living room, from cartridge to console, there had been someone who understood that the game was the thing. The experience was the thing. The feeling of picking up a controller and forgetting, for a moment, that the outside world existed. That person was Nolan Bushnell. And when he left, nobody filled that role. Not because it couldn't be done, but because nobody thought it needed to be. When a founder leaves, not just the company, the why of the company, the reason it was built in the first place, walks out with them. And the people who remain, they know what to do, they know how to do it, but they've forgotten why. Nolan Bushnell went on to start dozens of other companies. Some succeeded, some didn't. He never stopped building, because that's who he is. Not a businessman, not a suit, not a number on a quarterly report, a builder. And somewhere beneath that New Mexico desert, under millions of pounds of concrete and broken promises, the game he started is still there, waiting.